And what you should really be focusing on for next year, I'm someone who really believes that being early is better than being on time when it comes to trends in this vertical specifically. It is painful to be early, but it is always worth it. Good marketing should cooperate with culture. It should not co-opt culture in any type of way. One of the core pillars of being good at marketing, just empathy and curiosity. What type of content is that person already seeing? And what do they like about that? To understand that, you have to understand I love working with Pilot House because while we are a performance marketing agency, we really pride ourselves on caring so much about brand and creative. At Pilot House, we don't just make ads, we craft them. Every edit, every word, every scroll-stopping detail is built with purpose and care, and I truly believe that care drives creativity and creativity drives results. Our attention to both scale and brand allows us to craft strategies that deliver you short-term results while making you long-term successful, which is so important for any DTC brand. If you are curious about learning more about working with Pilot House, you can fill out a lead form at pilothouse.co and let them know you want to go on a brand new ad venture. You don't actually have to say that. You don't have to make a pun. I'm not going to force you to make a pun. Just fill out the lead form. We'd love to chat with you. Hi, welcome back to Ad-venturous, the podcast produced by DTC and hosted by me, Aves. Today, I wanted to sort of wrap up our series, which has kind of turned into a bit of a Christmas Carol situation, if I might. We've really covered sort of past, present, and future of how to show up as a brand and gain relevancy in the DTC sphere. And so that was unintentional, but 'tis the season. I love watching the Muppets version of the Christmas Carol. To me, that is the ultimate version of that story. But I will also say, as a fun fact, I first saw like Mickey Mouse version of that story. And so I thought Scrooge McDuck was like the original iteration of Scrooge. And I have a really hard time not saying Scrooge McDuck because it's so like ingrained in my mind that it's Scrooge McDuck and he was like the original variation of Scrooge. But no, that's false. In fact, Charles Dickens wrote that novel a very long time ago. Anyway, back to the episode. So we kind of talked a little bit about in that initial episode, sort of where we're coming from. And I wanted you guys to fill out a message box and start thinking about your brand a little bit. And then last week's episode, we talked about Dada. We talked about the history of Dada as a movement. We talked about what it could mean that we're starting to see these early sort of signals of Dadaism-esque content popping up and popping off as well. And today I wanted to sort of round things out by talking about present sort of DTC activations and what you should really be focusing on for next year. I'm someone who really believes that being early is better than being on time when it comes to trends in this vertical specifically. It is painful to be early, but it is always worth it. So I think last week I really wanted to lay out some of the ways in which people's expectations around brand are shifting and how you can start thinking about that and making moves to really be able to meet folks where they are in a couple of years from now. But yeah, this week's episode, I really want to talk about where we are right now, which is, I think, in a very Norman Rockwell-esque era of brand and content and DTC marketing. Norman Rockwell is a really interesting figure in both art and also advertising. I am forever fascinated by this idea that art and advertising exist on the same spectrum and they exist with the same purpose and they exist with the same sort of intent a lot of the time. But it's like when you get into the specifics of both where things start to fall apart. So if you think about it, it's like from a 10,000 foot view, both art and marketing, they're pieces of content. They're things that are made to make you feel something. A lot of the time, obviously, when we're looking at marketing, we're creating something with the intent expression of making you feel some type of way on behalf of a brand. And it doesn't have much to do with the individual creating the ad itself, where if we think about the creation of art, obviously, if you're sitting down to write a poem or if you're painting a painting, you're doing that as a way to express what's going on with you internally and to just be able to show that and represent that in a more physical medium. So it's like, yeah, when you get into the more nitty gritty, things do start to fall apart with the comparison of art versus marketing. But I think that the two speak to each other in a way that we don't always talk about, especially in DTC and especially in the performance marketing area specifically. We tend to ignore the fact that art and culture really drive what we do as marketers. And then sometimes things like fold back into themselves in a really interesting way. I think about Got Milk, which was our first episode. I love to talk about milk. Got Milk was one of those rare instances where advertising became culture in a way. And I think it's a really clear-cut example of that happening, where we started with the express intent of making people feel irritation around not having milk and, remembering what that feels like, and the frustration when you go to get milk out of the fridge and there's none there. The original intent was to inspire that feeling in people so that they went out and bought milk, which, again, I talked about this in the first episode ever of the pod, like how crazy to market milk. It's so funny to me. It's never not going to be funny. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's just like, it's literally milk. Like, what do you mean your job is to advertise milk? That we're hiring people to do that. Anyway, that is a really clear-cut example. So the original intent was to make people feel that frustration around there not being milk in the fridge and then motivate them to go buy milk itself. And what's really interesting is when we start to kind of pull apart what happened with that marketing campaign, it then became a symbol, like that the typeface used, the way that it was presented, the milk mustaches in a way, what it symbolized to be a celebrity and to be included in that campaign. And then just obviously the spin-offs. Got Blank was such a cultural phenomenon. It still kind of is. Like if I see that and it works, it kind of tickles me a little bit. But yeah, that was a way where like you can see a really clear line from the intent starting in a very specific place from a brand and milk point of view, and then moving into this sort of art space where people were using the Got Blank archetype to express different things that were personal to them. So I feel like that is a really good example of the two existing in the same plane. Something that I say again and again, and I think is really important, like in this episode when we're talking about Norman Rockwell and blurring the lines between art and culture and advertising, something that is really, really important, and I hope you can really, really hear this and like take it on board, is that good marketing should cooperate with culture. It should not co-opt culture in any type of way. At the end of the day, you are a brand. You are not a person. And I think it's very important to make that distinction. And what helps me do that is someone who obviously loves art. We did a whole episode last week about Dada. Like I do love art and I do love the artistic process, but something that really helps me to separate the two is remembering that I am making this piece of content with a point of view that relates directly to the brand and not a point of view that relates directly to me and my experiences as a person. I find that the cleanest way to make sure that I am cooperating with culture and not co-opting culture. It's really different when you're creating things on behalf of yourself as a person versus on behalf of a brand. It's a completely unique experience. So yeah, really important to remember and hear that and think about it as we move through this period right now of sort of Rockwell-esque mixing of art and marketing, and then potentially move in the future to a more Dada-esque landscape. It's really important to remember that. Again, we're not here to co-opt culture. We're not here to like seamlessly become people and creators. If you are a brand, you are a brand, and making that delineation is really important. So using Norman Rockwell as an example, one of the most prolific American artists of all time, his work is really specific in that it defined a sort of post-war era and an entire culture. And it didn't do so by our example of Dadaism, which was let's directly challenge what's going on in the overall zeitgeist. What is art? Let's create anti-art art. What a Norman Rockwell piece did was it held up a mirror to a regular person in a regular town in any state in America. And it did so sort of very unflinchingly. I don't think he gets enough credit for the way that he sometimes experimented with different mediums and how he painted. But what's so interesting about Norman Rockwell is that there were no frills and bells about what he was presenting. And he wasn't like always pushing a sort of next step in time agenda. That's not to say that his art wasn't political, because it oftentimes was, but his art tied back to what was actually happening right then and there. He wasn't too focused on the past, and he wasn't at all focused on the future. He was just holding up a mirror to people as they already existed. And that really resonated at the time. And I think when you are able to tap into that as a marketer, that Rockwell-esque, really grounded approach of just showing people someone that looks similar to them and someone who has similar values and a similar aesthetic in their home, it really does make all of the difference, especially at this point in digital marketing and in e-commerce content. What's particularly interesting to me as someone who, again, likes to straddle that line between like art and marketing is that Norman Rockwell obviously is a very prolific artist, but he also worked as an illustrator and a advertiser in a way. He was drawing up ads for really big brands like Coca-Cola. And what's so interesting to think about America at that time and this rise in capitalism and consumerism and a true comfort in conformity, which I don't always think is a bad thing. I think what's so interesting is that he didn't change the style in which he worked when he was working as an advertiser versus working as just an artist. I think that that is very telling to where people were at that point in time. And again, it really speaks volumes of the way that people could connect with his work and the way that he presented American life. And again, not to say that he was never like pushing things forward with the way he was presenting and creating scenes. He was, but he was doing so in a really grounded, earnest way. And so how do you apply that thinking directly to content and creative strategy heading into 2026? It's a great question. I feel like sometimes these episodes get really heavy on the like last week, just really diving into the history of what data meant. But I feel like this week it's good to really talk about something that I hope most of us know about Norman Rockwell, something that's very well known. And then how do we apply that framing and thinking to the work that we do now as advertisers? And for me personally, a lot of this work comes down to research, which I've talked about a lot before. So really researching, understanding within my customer segments, like what language and what visuals I need to use to speak to specific personas. I think this also really comes down to, for me, like one of the core pillars of being good at marketing, which is truly just empathy and curiosity for what people are genuinely interested in. This is something that I have talked about a lot, both on the podcast and off the podcast, which is that, it's all sort of fine and dandy to be able to give me segmentation insights on who we want to go after if we're working with a brand. I'm looking at my iPad. So say we're Apple, which is a big swing, and we are looking to create a new iPad. Men aren't buying enough iPads, so we really feel like we need to release a campaign for men in their 30s, and we need to convince them that they want iPads. I think something that brands do a lot of is they just make an assumption that they can speak to really product-specific pieces and that will in a way translate to the audience that they're talking to. But the fact of the matter is, it's like visually you have to appeal to them before the actual product does, especially these days when content is so important. So something I think about a lot is creator-focused content and how I'm showing up in a really authentic way. I think that's probably where I think the most about Norman Rockwell in the process, in sort of casting and also styling content creators and video content specifically. It's such a powerful tool, whether you're, running on a platform like Meta, where you're going to have a mix of statics and video, but so many kind of up and coming platforms. Like we work with AppLovin, Pinterest is a mix of both, but Snapchat as well, TikTok Shop, like all of these big platforms, you require such high volume of video content. And so I think thinking about the principles of Norman Rockwell's art and really trying to hold up a genuine mirror that doesn't contain any judgment to your core persona or customer, and also in a way inspires them, is a really tricky mix. It's tricky and hard to do, but once you can do it and get into the rhythm, it starts to really make a lot of sense. So if we're using that iPad example, where we really want men in their 30s to buy an iPad, what we might first do is really think about what kind of men in their 30s are going to buy an iPad, because there's a lot of different types of men in their 30s. So really zero into our research, figure out who it is. But say it's like a single guy who loves to play video games, and that is who we're going after, because the new iPad has much higher gaming potential. It's got more RAM. That's actually a really good idea. Like an iPad with like a giga amount of RAM. If I could play World of Warcraft on my iPad, I would start playing World of Warcraft again. So if you work at Apple and you're listening, get me an iPad that I can play World of Warcraft on, and I will buy a secondary iPad just for that. And I'll talk about it just as much. I'll talk about it double. I'm getting distracted thinking about my iPad. But that is the like persona. So the segment we're going after, we're looking at men in their 30s. Persona is like single guy, loves playing cozy video games. We've got this new juiced up iPad that we can offer him. Part of how you're going to approach that, if you are smart, is really think about what type of content is that person already seeing and what do they like about that. And so this is where the sort of consumer insights and research piece really plays a big part, because to understand that, you have to understand where that person is living online. So you have to know what platforms they're going on. And then you have to start to sort of correlate that data of platform with some search insights. So when they are looking to buy, maybe an iPad versus a Steam Deck versus a PS5, like we're looking at all these different consoles. What are they looking for in those other consoles that they're not getting? Those are usually insights you can get from just, Google search insights, really easy top line, or you can use more sophisticated software if you probably would if you were doing this for Apple. But you get the gist. Like look for how people are searching for like very close competitor products. And then what I do sort of from there, and that is what I think about as a like foundational layer of understanding an actual targeted persona. What I do from there is I start finding content creators in that space and watching them like in the background when I may be writing notes for this podcast or prepping another piece of work. I will be looking at those creators and listening. This is a audio experience, but I'm pointing to my ears as you would with children. I am listening deeply to hear how they talk and what their values are. This is really just kind of human behavior stuff, but really starting to understand what drives these folks to make a purchase. And a lot of the times with a lot of these like cohorts and these personas that we're looking at, you can easily find lifestyle creators who make their living like selling things in YouTube videos. So that's a really good place to start, where it's like looking for a dude in my target persona who's maybe making content about tech that he buys and promoting. That's going to be a really good place to understand, okay, what are the USPs that he's saying? And again, I'm pointing to my ears. What are the USPs that he's saying the most? When he's reviewing a product, what is he kind of typically looking for? And just, again, really trying to define and understand straight from the horse's mouth what matters to them, so that when you get to that place where you're actually going to start, casting your own creators or coming up with your own ad concepts and angles, you already have this full suite of knowledge to work off of. And you're not just copy and pasting the same old iPad campaign for a new audience with angles that you think might work with them. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes I see people make when it comes to creating content that actually resonates. And so it does take a lot of work. I know, like anecdotally, Norman Rockwell just lived in like smaller towns sometimes, and he just painted life as he saw it happening. And so I try to emulate that as much as possible when I am creating content. And my favorite thing to do is work with brands who are so far away from who I am as a demographic, because it makes the work a little bit easier. And it's also just way more fun to like go out and explore and see what other people are doing. But yeah, once you've set that like foundation up for yourself, so you've done some search insights, you really understand what people are looking for and how they buy, that is when, like I said, you can start to see the rubber sort of meet the road and actually apply these things to your marketing efforts and also to your brand as a whole. I kind of want to talk about what I just said there, your brand as a whole, how to apply this. I think something that I've also seen firsthand over this past year is that the most successful brands are really stagnant in sort of the material that you would put in, say, a message box, like we talked about in the first episode, but they flow freely with the way that they translate that stagnant core message of their brand. And I think that is a really important thing to remember as we're heading into 2026, where, I've seen this take a lot, where it's kind of like paid social is not going to change a lot, but if you don't shift your strategy, you are going to be in a bit of trouble. And I think what people are trying to express with that is that we're coming into a different era, like we mentioned last week with the chats on data, but we still do exist, I think, in this Rockwell-esque zeitgeist where people are really finding comfort in seeing themselves and really finding comfort in a sense of conformity and sameness, because it can feel a little bit unifying and it can feel very safe. And I think people are really still enjoying that and that era. So I think it's, really important to keep that in mind, where you should have like a message box exercise or whatever you have to really define your brand, and then stick to that, but be really flexible and agile in the way that you express your brand. So that means like different forms of content, like different types, as well as different angles, and maybe kind of net new ways of positioning yourself in the market as well. But as long as they tether back to that original central point of your brand, you're not going to really be at risk of diminishing your brand in any way, shape, or form. You're just creating like a mosaic all over the internet of who you are, what you represent, and what you sell, which is like one of the most fundamental keys to success in building brand relevancy, especially in this age where every single platform you're going to be running on requires a ton of content, and it has to be a ton of good content. Crazy. It's got us creative strategists working overtime. It's got us working hard. But it's like, that is the reality. You have to be willing to create that mosaic. You can't just show up the same way on every platform, and you can't show up the same way for every persona within your segmentation strategy. It's just not going to work, and you're not going to see the growth that you want to see. So really keeping that in mind heading into 2026, I think is like the healthiest thing you can do. And really, again, like trying to do this work that we sort of outlined here of figuring out who you're actually talking to, what they want to hear, and then mirroring that back to them. We sometimes get into these traps, I think, with the rise of creator content, of overproducing aspirational content, and people have been and will continue to be kind of sick of that. You don't want to see that in ads. I think as well with the rise in generative AI, it's really tough to paint this perfect picture of like, if you buy this iPad that you can play World of Warcraft on, all of your problems are going to go away. I think people are becoming desensitized to that in a way. And it's like, once I buy that iPad, it's not like I'm going to have a big fancy house and be a big fancy creator. In fact, the opposite, I'll probably lose my job because I'll be playing World of Warcraft so darn much. But it's like, in that, I think there's actually something valuable, which is like people understand the reality of their situations a little bit more, and they really understand the reality of creator content. And so taking a page out of Norman Rockwell's playbook and just mirroring things to people as they are and as they exist, and just creating what you see organically out there is one of the biggest ways that you can be successful and build relevancy in the like immediate few months, and especially I think all throughout 2026. But yeah, that was the episode today. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was enjoyable. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and leave a comment if there's any topics you want to cover heading into the new year. I'm really excited. I feel like I have a lot of exciting plans and strategies that I'm activating with clients. It's going to be really a cool, fun year, I think, to work in creative strategy. And I think this past year was like a year of learning for a lot of people, and next year is going to be, just an exciting one where still a lot of lessons to be learned, but also a lot of like strategies and structures in place. And if you really want to hit some growth goals and you're not sure where to start, you can book a call, head over to the Pilot House website. And if you say you came through the Ad-venturous podcast, we can chat directly. Over at Pilot House, we do everything from Amazon to CRO, meta, strategy. So much of the e-commerce journey we have handled time and time again. And I will say as well, I say this a lot, not on the podcast, but like working at and working with Pilot House is really fun and exciting, especially heading into a year like 2026, because we are a team of people who love growth marketing, and that is unique but it's also really cool and it's really fun because we're a team of people who like I mentioned before, whether it's Amazon, email, search, whatever it is that's part of the e-commerce journey, we are so excited about growth and so excited about hitting and breaking scale ceilings and floors. It's what really like makes us all excited. So that's why I am very excited heading into 2026. And like I mentioned, if you need help with any sort of point in the funnel, or if you're just curious about what we do and how we do it, you can head over to the website and book a call. But that is it, the last episode for this year. Thank you so much for listening. If you have listened this year, it has been really fun to start this podcast and to yap, and I will chat to you all next week.